Imagine boarding a routine flight, expecting nothing more than a few hours of calm and comfort, only to find yourself at the center of a storm you never asked for. On Polaris Airways Flight 697, a simple seating arrangement became the spark that ignited a powerful confrontation, one that would expose raw truths about race, dignity, and entitlement at 30,000 feet. Who really holds the power when privilege clashes with quiet strength? How does a single moment of refusal to yield become a profound act of courage? And what happens when the world watches? When a viral video captures not just a clash of passengers, but the heartbeat of a deeper social reckoning? This isn't just a story about a seat on a plane. It's about two women whose lives become entwined in an unexpected battle for respect, identity, and justice. Their journey challenges us all to ask difficult questions. What does it mean to claim your space? How do we confront discomfort without denying humanity? And can grace and accountability coexist in a world so often divided? Join us as we unpack this unforgettable story. If it moves you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful true stories that make us think, feel, and hope. The air inside Atlanta's Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport buzzed with the low hum of motion. It was a Tuesday morning like any other, a symphony of rolling suitcases, echoing boarding calls, coffee-fueled conversations, and the rustle of boarding passes filled the concourse. Beneath the glass ceilings of Concourse E, sunlight spilled across the polished floors and fractured beams, casting dancing reflections under hurried footsteps. Camille Thornton walked with practiced confidence, her nude heels clicking crisply against the tile. Her cream pantsuit hugged her frame immaculately, and her silk scarf, Hermes, of course, rested in a perfect knot at her neck. A designer roller bag followed obediently behind her, and a monogrammed Louis Vuitton tote swung from one shoulder. Her hair, a sleek platinum bob, didn't shift as she moved. She had mastered the art of keeping everything appearances, emotions, people in place. At 47, Camille was Senior Vice President of Global Strategy at Helix Petrocorp, one of the largest private energy conglomerates in the country. Her career had been a climb carved in stilettos and steel. She didn't just expect excellence. She demanded it from others, but most of all, from the world itself. Delays annoyed her. Incompetence infuriated her. And any disruption to her carefully crafted comfort was an insult to her sense of control. She walked up to gate E14 and scanned the boarding display. Polaris Airways Flight 627, destination Belize City, boarding Group 1. That was her. She exhaled softly, relieved. Nothing was more intolerable than waiting in line behind people who didn't know how to travel. She glanced around the gate, scanning the passengers. Flip-flops, cargo shorts, oversized hats, children climbing on chairs. She rolled her eyes. Camille wasn't flying for business this time. She was heading to Belize for a 5-day wellness retreat, recommended by her therapist after she'd nearly collapsed during a Q3 strategy review. Meditation, silence, detox, a break, though meticulously scheduled. She planned to unplug just enough to pretend she wasn't still managing 4 teams remotely. A few seats away, a woman sat with quiet poise. She wore a navy blue jumpsuit, simple silver earrings, and her hair, thick and beautifully braided, was gathered over one shoulder like a crown. She looked to be in her early 50s, maybe a few years older than Camille, though it was hard to tell. Her face was calm, thoughtful, intelligent. She held a leather-bound journal in one hand and a paperback book in the other, occasionally underlining phrases with a smooth flick of a pen. Dr. Zora Whitaker had arrived nearly an hour early. She always did. Airports reminded her of transition spaces, like the quiet pause between chapters in a book. She used the time to observe, to think, and sometimes just to breathe. Zora was a tenured professor of cultural history at Penwick University in New York. She had published 4 books, lectured in 5 countries, and mentored more students than she could count. But the world rarely saw any of that when she walked into a room. More often than not, it saw her skin first, then her hair, then her clothes, then, sometimes, it decided she was either remarkable or invisible. Today, she was flying to Belize to keynote an international conference on diasporic memory and resilience. She'd planned her lectures months in advance, and her notes, carefully organized in her tote, had small tabs labeled with themes: survival, dignity, erasure, resistance, words she had studied for decades, words she had lived. The gate agent's voice crackled over the speaker, announcing pre-boarding. Families with small children lined up first, then elderly passengers, then active military. Camille stood from her seat with a soft, irritated sigh. The gate agent was young, chipper, and entirely too loud. She scanned Camille's pass with a smile that went unacknowledged. "Enjoy your flight, Ms. Thornton." Camille offered a thin-lipped smile and marched down the jet bridge. Her seat was 3A aisle, comfort class, just enough room to avoid the indignity of economy, but without the cost or crowd of first. She arrived at her row, placed her tote under the seat, and hoisted her suitcase into the overhead with a grunt of annoyance. The man across the aisle had already spilled into the shared space, his elbow comfortably resting on the armrest that would inevitably become hers. She pulled out a silk eye mask and a travel-size lavender spray. She was settling into what she called her airborne fortress, an invisible shield built of curated comfort, silent expectations, and cold civility. Back at the gate, Zora heard her group called, Group 1. She stood quietly, gathering her things. Her boarding pass had been issued late due to a change in aircraft, but the attendant had assured her the seat was still comfort class. Row 3B, window. As she stepped into the plane, the familiar scent of recirculated air mixed with citrus disinfectant met her nose. She offered a soft, "Good morning" to the crew at the front and began walking down the aisle. Camille saw her approaching. Her expression shifted almost imperceptibly. The eyes tightened, the lips compressed. The hands paused their graceful fidgeting with the blanket. Zora arrived at row 3 and gave a gentle, professional smile. "Excuse me. I believe I'm in the window seat." Camille didn't move. She slowly looked Zora up and down. The braid, the jumpsuit, the confident presence. Her fingers curled against the armrest. She said nothing, just stared. Zora tilted her head politely. "Seat 3B, I believe that's mine." Camille responded without looking at her. "Yes, I heard you." Still, she didn't move. The aisle behind Zora began to fill. A line of passengers was forming. Someone behind her cleared their throat. Zora's heart didn't race. It didn't need to. She had been in this kind of moment before, hundreds of times. It was as familiar as it was exhausting. She looked at Camille again, this time not with a smile, but with the patience of someone who had run this emotional marathon before. "I'd appreciate it if you'd let me in." There was a pause. Then, with a sigh so theatrical it bordered on performance, Camille unbuckled her seatbelt and stood barely moving her legs. Zora slid past her, careful not to touch, but as her sleeve brushed the edge of Camille's blazer, Camille flinched, like something offensive had made contact. Zora sat, placed her journal in the seat pocket, buckled her belt. She didn't say another word, and neither did Camille. But the tension between them had already taken flight. Zora adjusted the strap of her tote and exhaled slowly as she settled into her seat. The smell of Camille's overpowering perfume clung in the narrow space between them, sharp and artificial. She turned her face toward the window, letting her eyes rest on the slow movement of ground crew beneath them. She focused on their fluorescent vests, the rhythm of their steps, the way they signaled to each other with gloved hands. Anything to keep her gaze and her thoughts away from the presence sitting just inches beside her. Camille, meanwhile, shifted noisily in her seat. Her elbows moved with purpose, marking her territory. She pulled a small bottle of rose-scented hand sanitizer from her tote, uncapped it with a click that was louder than necessary, and began applying it to her palms. Not once, twice. Then, with a practiced swipe, she wiped down the armrest between them with a disposable cloth she seemed to produce out of nowhere. She didn't glance at Zora, but the message was clear. Zora saw it, felt it. That silent theater of rejection wasn't new, but here, confined to a narrow row, it scraped across her already worn patience like sandpaper. Still, she said nothing. She had a conference to focus on, a lecture to deliver. This flight wasn't her battlefield. It was supposed to be 3 quiet hours in the sky. Nothing more. Camille leaned back, pulled her blanket up to her chest, and muttered just loud enough to be heard, "Unbelievable." Zora turned, her voice level and deliberate. "Excuse me." Camille looked straight ahead. "Nothing," she replied, her tone drenched in dismissal. She adjusted her eye mask with the dramatic flair of someone starring in her own invisible movie. Behind them, the aisle filled. Boarding group after group trickled through. Laughter. The hiss of overhead bins opening and closing. A child asking why the windows don't open in planes. The usual chorus of departure. In row 4 just behind them, Julian Vega took his seat, a freelance journalist and content creator. Julian traveled often and packed light. His curly hair was tucked under a beanie, and his hoodie bore the faded logo of his alma mater. He had noticed the tension as soon as he stepped into the aisle. The body language in row 3 was unmistakable. He didn't mean to listen, but the air in that row was louder than words. He heard the muttered comment, saw the elbowing, the second bottle of sanitizer. Julian pulled out his phone not to film, not yet, but to jot down notes. Something about the stillness felt dangerous, like a fault line waiting to split. Camille shifted again, annoyed by the proximity of a woman she had decided was beneath her. The injustice of it filled her like pressure in a sealed bottle. She paid for this seat. She earned this seat. Why was she being forced to tolerate someone like that? She glanced at Zora's notebook, which now rested open in her lap. Handwritten pages, quotes, names she didn't recognize. Camille scoffed. Zora didn't respond, but she felt the sharp sting of the gesture. A small sigh escaped her. She had told herself she wouldn't let it get to her. But these were the cuts that bruised deepest. Not loud insults, not slurs. Just the small, precise, relentless message that you are not welcome. Not here, not next to me. Flight attendant Riley Beckett walked briskly down the aisle, checking seat belts and overhead bins. She had been with Polaris Airways for 9 years. She could spot turbulence, emotional or atmospheric, from across a cabin, and row 3 was vibrating with it. Riley paused beside them, her smile warm but edged with caution. "Is everything okay here?" Camille seized the moment. "Actually, no," she said, pulling off her eye mask. "I'm not comfortable. I need to be moved." Zora looked up, her face calm but alert. Riley blinked. "I'm sorry to hear that. Is there a problem with your seat?" Camille gestured not with a finger, but with her chin toward Zora. "I'm just not comfortable sitting here. Surely there's something else open. I'm a Premier Gold member." Riley's eyes flicked between them. She had heard this kind of tone before. Too many times. The discomfort wasn't about legroom. It was about presence, about proximity. Zora didn't move, didn't speak, but her silence was loud. Her hands gently closed the notebook in her lap. "I'm sorry," Riley said evenly. "The flight is fully booked. We're just about to close the door." Camille leaned forward slightly, her voice lower now, intended only for Riley. "I'm not asking for a lot. I just want to feel safe." That word, safe. Zora's spine stiffened. Riley's face didn't move, but inside, something flinched. She knew what Camille was implying, that the black woman beside her was a threat, a disruption, an intrusion on her sense of comfort. She took a breath. "Ma'am, you are in your assigned seat, and unless there's a medical concern, I'm afraid we can't change it." Camille's eyes narrowed. "I'll speak to someone else. I am the lead on this flight," Riley said gently. "You are welcome to file a concern after we land." Camille exhaled, sharp and loud. "So I have to just sit here and deal with this." The passengers around them had gone quiet. Words travel faster in silence. Zora looked up now, not in anger, not in shame, but with the steady, unyielding dignity of someone who had earned the right to take up space. "I'm Dr. Zora Whitaker," she said, her voice soft but resonant. "This is my assigned seat, and I won't be moving." Camille turned toward her for the first time, face flushed with disbelief. "Well, aren't you proud of yourself?" Zora didn't blink. No, just unwilling to disappear. Behind them, Julian Vega had begun recording. Not for fame, not for clicks, but because something told him this moment would matter. Riley nodded to Zora with a quiet, "Thank you," in her eyes, then turned to Camille. "I'll inform the captain that we're experiencing a passenger issue. Please remain seated." Camille's face burned. "Unbelievable," she muttered again, crossing her arms. Riley walked away, her heart pounding. She had seen racism before, masked as discomfort, cloaked in politeness. But this was something else, and she wasn't going to let it take off. In the cockpit, Captain Reed Mallory ran his final pre-flight checks. A 58-year-old veteran pilot. He had flown through thunderstorms and emergency landings, but the report Riley was about to bring him, it would take a different kind of turbulence to land. Captain Reed Mallory had been reviewing the final flight plan when the knock came at the cockpit door. He looked up from the checklist, his pen poised between two boxes, and turned to the narrow entryway. Riley Beckett's face appeared serious, composed, but carrying that familiar tension he had come to read like a second language. He gave her a nod. "Come in." She stepped inside, pulling the door softly closed behind her. "Captain, so we have a situation in row 3. He raised an eyebrow. "Medical." Riley shook her head. "No, sir. Passenger related? One of them is demanding a seat reassignment. She's using coded language, but it's not really coded. She doesn't want to sit next to the woman beside her." Captain Mallory's brow furrowed. "Did she say anything threatening?" "No, but what she didn't say is just as clear. The woman in 3A, Camille Thornton, is uncomfortable sitting next to Dr. Zora Whitaker. She hasn't used racial language directly, but it's obvious that's what this is about." He leaned back slightly in his chair, pen still in hand, but forgotten now. "How is Dr. Whitaker responding gracefully. She's calm, composed, refuses to be moved, and honestly, she shouldn't have to be. She's just being. Captain Mallory nodded slowly. Has anyone else noticed? Yes, sir. At least half the cabin, and one passenger's recording. I saw the phone come out. It's already unfolding. The captain was quiet for a beat. He'd flown over 30 years for Polaris. He'd seen drunken groomsmen, panic attacks, even an in-flight proposal that turned into a breakup before landing. But this wasn't that kind of chaos. This was deeper. This was social turbulence. And like real turbulence, it had to be handled with balance and authority or risk spreading panic throughout the cabin. He unbuckled his seatbelt and stood. Thank you. Riley. I'll speak to her directly. Riley gave him a grateful look. Be careful. She's loud. Entitled. I've been married before, he said with a dry smirk. I know the type. She allowed herself a breath of a laugh before stepping back out, letting the curtain fall behind her. Captain Mallory adjusted his collar, straightened his jacket, and stepped into the cabin. The effect was immediate. Heads turned. Conversations paused mid-word. Even the overhead chimes seemed to wait. Camille saw him coming and straightened in her seat like a student trying to erase a smirk before the principal arrived. Zora remained still, her hands loosely folded in her lap. She didn't look up. She didn't need to. The captain arrived at their row and placed a steady hand on the top of Camille's seat. Ms. Thornton, I'm Captain Mallory. She gave a tight smile, as if meeting someone she considered a peer. Captain, thank you. I assume Riley informed you of the issue. She did, he said evenly. And I want to be absolutely clear. Your assigned seat is 3A. That is where you are seated. Camille's expression flickered. Yes, but I'm uncomfortable. I paid for this seat. I'm a Premier Gold member, and I expected a premium experience. The captain remained calm, and you are receiving exactly what you paid for. A seat in comfort class aboard a fully booked aircraft, with the same rights and responsibilities as every other passenger here. Camille blinked. So you're refusing to move me? I'm not refusing. I'm informing you that there are no other seats available, and even if there were, we do not move passengers based on discriminatory discomfort. The word landed like a stone. Camille's voice rose. Discriminatory. Excuse me. I didn't say anything racist. No, you didn't, the captain said. But your actions and requests have made their message clear. Zora finally looked up, meeting his eyes for the first time. In his gaze, she saw what she had been waiting for. Not defense, not protection, just simple recognition. She wasn't invisible anymore. Captain Mallory turned slightly toward her. Dr. Whitaker, I apologize that this has been your experience today. You are in your correct seat, and you've acted with nothing but composure. Thank you for your patience. Zora nodded quietly. Thank you, Captain. The captain turned back to Camille. You have two choices. Ms. Thornton, you may remain in 3A without further comment to your seatmate or to the crew, and complete this flight to Belize. That's option 1. Camille opened her mouth to speak, but he lifted a hand, stopping her gently but firmly. Option 2 is that you refuse to comply, in which case you'll be removed from this aircraft immediately. Your luggage will be offloaded, and you may be subject to federal charges for interfering with a flight operation. Gas rustled through the nearby rows. Julian Vega, still filming from behind, focused his camera slightly closer. He had never seen authority wielded so quietly, so cleanly. Camille's face drained of color. "You can't be serious." "I assure you," Captain Mallory said, "I am." The silence was total. Even the crying toddler in 6D had gone quiet. Zora turned her face back to the window. Camille's hands trembled slightly as she gripped her purse. Her world, the one built on order, deference, and power, was being rewritten right in front of her, and she had no script for this version of herself. Finally, in a thin, brittle voice, she said, "I'll stay." The captain's expression didn't change, and Camille's jaw clenched. "I'm sorry for the disruption." He gave a small nod. "Very well. Thank you." He turned toward the front of the cabin and addressed everyone with a composed, professional tone. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We'll be closing the cabin doors shortly and beginning our journey to Belize. Flight time today is just under 3 hours. With that, he returned to the cockpit. As soon as the curtain closed behind him, a slow ripple of applause began. It started with a woman near the front, then moved like a wave down the rows. Zora didn't move, but her chest lifted in a soft breath that felt like the first real inhale in days. Julian leaned forward slightly and whispered, "You handled that with class." Zora glanced back with a nod. "Class isn't something you earn in a lounge." Camille sat rigid, her arms crossed, her face tight. The applause wasn't for her. It never would be again. Riley passed by once more. She didn't speak, but she gave Zora a look filled with quiet gratitude. As the wheels began to roll and the engines picked up their gentle roar, the cabin began to move on. But row 3 remained a quiet monument to something rarely witnessed in real time. A line had been drawn, and for once it had held. The plane began to taxi, a soft vibration humming through the floor beneath Zora's shoes. She closed her eyes briefly, letting the mechanical whir steady her pulse. For a moment, the hum of the engines drowned out everything else, the whispers, the judgment, the sting of being made a spectacle. Zora had never wanted to be seen that way, not as a symbol, not as a flashpoint in someone else's lesson. She had wanted peace, a quiet flight, time to reflect on her lecture and gather her thoughts. Now she was part of something much larger, something louder. And she didn't know yet whether that was justice or just another weight. Camille stared straight ahead. Her lips were pressed so tightly together they'd turned pale. Her fingers gripped the edge of her seat as the plane turned toward the runway. The embarrassment still burned hot across her face and neck. She could feel the eyes on her. She didn't dare turn her head, didn't want to see how many had watched, how many had heard, how many had filmed. Inside her chest, a storm brewed. She wasn't the villain. She knew it. She was just asking for comfort. That was all. Wasn't she entitled to that after everything she'd built, all she had sacrificed, the sleepless nights, the endless meetings, the promotions earned through fire? She had spent 2 decades proving herself in a male-dominated, high-pressure world. She had worked too hard to be humiliated by some flight attendant and a self-righteous pilot. But even she knew the truth. She had crossed a line. And now, the line had pushed back. As the plane accelerated down the runway, the cabin leaned into ascent. The overhead compartments rattled gently, and seat belts tugged against torsos. Camille shut her eyes tightly, forcing the thoughts away. Focus on the retreat, on the sound baths, on the ocean. Let the next few days erase this moment. Zora, meanwhile, watched the clouds through her small oval window. They were still climbing, but the earth was already a blur below them. From up here, Cities were nothing more than suggestions, lines and lights. Borders lost their meaning at 30,000 feet. Up here, there was only air and silence. Until now. A quiet tap came from behind. Zora turned slightly. It was Julian Vega, seated directly behind her. He leaned forward just enough to speak without disrupting others. "I hope this isn't intrusive," he said, "but I wanted to let you know I filmed part of what happened." The moment the captain stepped in, Zora blinked. "You filmed it." He nodded. "I wasn't planning to, but something told me it needed to be seen. I haven't posted it yet. I wanted to ask if that's something you're okay with." Zora took a slow breath. "And what would you post it as just the truth?" Julian said. "People need to see that silence doesn't always win, that someone stood up, that you stood your ground." Zora didn't answer immediately. Her mind raced. What would it mean going viral? Becoming a face? A symbol? Her inbox flooded. Her privacy gone. Her life rerouted. Was that justice or exploitation dressed as attention? She looked at him. He wasn't pushy. There was no hunger in his eyes. No greed. Just quiet solidarity. "If you post it," she said finally, "I ask only one thing. Don't make it about me being strong. Make it about what shouldn't have happened in the first place." Julian gave a slow, sincere nod. "That's fair." He returned to his seat. Zora turned back to her window. Her reflection stared back at her in the glass. Half sky, half self. A woman caught in a moment too big to control. Camille had heard every word. The mention of a video sent fresh panic through her like a second wave. She tried not to show it, but her breathing grew shallower. Her thoughts moved quickly now. What if the video reached her company, her boss, her clients? She had spent years building a brand of control and professionalism. What would happen if the world saw this version of her? She opened her phone and glanced around furtively. Airplane mode. Useless. No text could be sent. No spin could be crafted. Not yet. She glanced toward Zora. The woman was composed. Regal, even. It made Camille seethe. There was no remorse in that face. No fear. Camille felt herself tightening. Something inside her screamed to retaliate, to lash out. But there was nowhere for that fury to go now. The battle had been fought, and she had lost. Riley Beckett walked slowly down the aisle with the beverage cart, offering water and pretzels with a practiced calm. When she reached row 3, she paused. "Would either of you care for something to drink?" she asked. Camille refused to look at her. "No." Zora nodded. "Water. Please. Thank you." Riley handed her a cup with a small smile. "Just let me know if you need anything," she said, and moved on. Camille huffed softly. "Of course she gets the smile," she muttered. Zora didn't respond, but her hand tightened around the cup. In her mind, Zora could feel the slow rising of heat beneath her skin, the part of her that wanted to speak, to unload years of similar moments, of glares in elevators, of security guards following her in bookstores, of women like Camille whispering behind her back, always just quiet enough to deny it. But she had done that work already. She had carried that burden through books, through lectures, through sleepless nights preparing lessons on dignity and identity. She didn't owe Camille anything now, not even her anger. She turned instead to her notebook, opening it carefully. Her pen moved slowly, then faster, as she wrote the heading for a new section, Flight 627. She didn't know if it would become part of a book, a lecture, a conversation, but the words came anyway. Meanwhile, back in row 4, Julian was editing his video. He trimmed it for clarity. No faces but Camille's were visible. The audio was crisp. The captain's voice rang like a hammer wrapped in velvet. The moment Camille surrendered to the authority of decency played like a scene from a courtroom drama. He paused before posting, then added a caption. When you refuse to move your seat because you don't want to sit next to a black woman. And the pilot teaches you the meaning of accountability. He added a few hashtags. Captain Mallory, your Polaris Airways, flying while black. Then he uploaded it. Across the aisle, a teenage girl nudged her mother and whispered, "Mom, did you hear what happened in the front row?" The mother nodded. "Yes, and that pilot, he did the right thing." Camille closed her eyes. The words stung more than she'd expected. She would have 3 hours to think about them, to stew, to wonder, and by the time they landed, the internet would already know her name. Polaris Airways. Flight 627. Cruised smoothly above the Gulf of Mexico. A gentle hum filled the cabin, the engine steady and calm. Passengers shifted in their seats, unwrapped granola bars, whispered quietly, or dozed with heads tilted toward cabin windows streaked with soft sunlight. But in row 3, silence took a different shape. Camille hadn't moved in nearly 40 minutes. Her hands remained clasped tightly in her lap, her shoulders rigid. Every now and then, she glanced over at Zora, hoping for a crack in her calm. There wasn't one. The woman next to her didn't seem shaken. If anything, she looked at peace, composed, as if nothing had happened. That infuriated Camille more than anything. She had built her life on being the one in control, the one who walked into a boardroom and made silence happen. But on this plane, in this seat, she had been stripped of her status, not with shouting, not with accusation, just by being called out, publicly, and being made to sit with it. Literally. She crossed her legs sharply, then uncrossed them, adjusted her scarf, straightened her belt. Nothing made her feel less trapped. Behind her, in row 4, Julian Vega scrolled through the video he had posted less than 20 minutes ago. He refreshed his screen. The numbers had jumped. Nearly 1,200 views in under half an hour. Shares were climbing. He knew the tipping point was close. He had only added a short caption, but the clip spoke for itself. A woman demanding not to sit next to a black woman. A captain delivering a quiet but unwavering rebuke. And a passenger whose silence held more weight than any argument. He refreshed again. 27,000 views. His fingers moved quickly now. He tweeted a follow-up, tagging Polaris Airways and adding a single line. "If this is the kind of leadership they train their pilots for, I'll fly Polaris every time." The likes came in faster than he could count. Camille shifted again. She hadn't said a word since the captain left. But inside, her mind was racing, spinning, clawing at all the things she should have said, should have done. She pulled out her phone again, still in airplane mode. She tapped the screen, uselessly trying to check for messages. She imagined the emails waiting for her, a calendar full of high-level meetings, a call from Gregory Vaughn, her CEO. He didn't tolerate public spectacle, especially now, with Helix Petrocorp trying to shed its reputation as an old-world oil giant. They were rebranding, leaning into community engagement, equity partnerships, youth initiatives. She had led some of those campaigns. The irony tasted bitter. Next to her, Zora turned another page in her notebook. Her pen moved with elegant precision. She didn't need to look at Camille. She could feel the tension radiating off her. She had seen this before. the desperate quiet of someone losing control. Zora had taught seminars on power, on the history of racial space, on who is allowed to take up room and who is expected to shrink. But no classroom prepared her for this kind of moment, to be physically present, emotionally wounded, and still expected to explain herself, to educate others through the sting of their disrespect. But this time, she didn't have to teach. The lesson had already been delivered. She turned her head slightly, not to speak, but to breathe deeply through her nose. The scent of Camille's expensive perfume still lingered, but now it mixed with something else. The soft aroma of citrus from the drink Zora had finished, the cool clarity of altitude, the knowledge that, for once, she wasn't the one being asked to move. Julian leaned toward the aisle, catching a glimpse of Riley as she emerged from the galley. He gestured discreetly. She approached. "Quick question," he whispered. "I posted the video. It's blowing up. You might want to let the captain know." Riley blinked. Already Julian nodded. "It's viral." She nodded. "Thank you. I'll pass that along." She walked toward the cockpit, her steps slightly quicker than before. Camille saw the exchange. Her stomach dropped, her face flushed. Not just with anger now, but with fear. She turned slowly toward Zora, the words building behind her teeth. She wanted to say something, anything, maybe an apology, or maybe just a justification, a plea to be understood, to be forgiven. But Zora's posture didn't invite conversation. She wasn't hostile. She was just finished. Camille turned back toward the aisle, biting the inside of her cheek until she tasted blood. In the cockpit, Riley relayed the news. Captain Mallory gave a slow nod. Not surprised. Not in this world. "You want me to prepare a statement for landing?" she asked. He considered it. "No, not yet. If it blows over, we let it. If not, Polaris will handle it." Riley hesitated. "Sir, with all respect, this one's not going to blow over." He looked at her, a long, thoughtful gaze. Then he reached for the intercom and made the standard landing announcement. Back in the cabin, phones began coming out as airplane mode lifted. Signals returned. Notifications exploded. Julian's phone buzzed constantly. Dozens of DMs. Verified accounts asking for permission to use the clip. A message from a major news outlet. Camille's phone chimed too. She hesitated, afraid to open the screen. She did anyway. The first thing she saw was a message from her assistant. "Camille, what is this video going around? Are you okay?" Her mouth went dry. She scrolled down. A second message. "They're tagging you. A lot." A third. "Helix PR team is trying to contain it. But your name is already out there. Just giving you a heads up." She stopped reading. The pit in her stomach deepened. Next to her, Zora was powering down her tablet, preparing for descent. Her breathing was steady, her hands calm. Camille suddenly hated her for it. Zora felt the stare and turned her head slightly, just enough to meet Camille's eyes. There was no hatred there, no smugness, just recognition and something else. Sadness. The kind of sadness that comes from knowing this wasn't the first time and wouldn't be the last. Camille looked away. When the wheels finally touched down in Belize City, the cabin exhaled. The landing was smooth, routine. But for the passengers in row 3, nothing about this flight had been routine. As the plane rolled to a stop and the chime signaled arrival, Zora gathered her things with quiet precision. Camille waited, hoping to exit first. But Zora stood smoothly and stepped into the aisle without hesitation. No need to shrink. Julian caught up to her near the exit. "Thank you," he said softly. for holding your ground. Zora looked at him. I wasn't trying to be brave, she said. I was just trying to get to Belize. And with that, she stepped into the light of the open door, unaware that outside that aircraft, the world was already catching fire. The humid air of Belize hit like a warm wall as passengers stepped onto the tarmac. The scent of salt and jet fuel mingled with the distant rumble of taxiing engines. Zora Whitaker descended the metal stairs one step at a time, her eyes adjusting to the bright sun overhead. She clutched her tote against her side and let the air fill her lungs slowly. She had landed, in more ways than one. Behind her, Camille Thornton stayed frozen in her seat for a moment longer than necessary. The rest of the cabin had emptied quickly, but she lingered, her pulse racing. She could already feel it, the shift. Her name, her face, her silence. It was no longer just hers. Somewhere in the digital world outside, it was being passed from person to person, judged, mocked, dissected. She finally stood, her legs stiff, her expression unreadable. She stepped off the plane with her head high, but inside she was unraveling. At baggage claim. Zora waited calmly. Her carry-on took time to appear, but she didn't pace or check her watch. She stood with the patience of someone who understood that waiting, when done without resentment, could be an act of quiet power. She saw Julian a few feet away, typing furiously on his phone. He looked up and met her eyes. "It's everywhere," he said softly. "Just since we landed. News blogs, Reddit, even a celebrity retweeted it." Zora didn't flinch. "Is my name in it?" "Not in the caption, but people are asking. They'll find out eventually." Zora gave a small nod. Of course they will. She didn't fear attention. She had spoken in rooms filled with hundreds, sometimes thousands. But this wasn't the same. This wasn't academic applause or professional validation. This was spectacle. This was what happened when dignity was forced into the spotlight against its will. Julian hesitated before adding, "You handled it with more grace than most people would have. Just so you know." "Grace," Zora repeated, almost as a question. "It's not grace. It's muscle memory." He looked at her with quiet understanding. A text buzzed on Julian's phone. His jaw tightened slightly as he read it. "They've ID'd her," he said. "Camille Thornton, Helix Petrocorp, Senior Vice President. It's trending now." Zora exhaled slowly. So that's the direction this goes. A few moments later, her suitcase emerged from the carousel. She took it, nodded a polite goodbye to Julian, and walked toward the exit. Outside the terminal, a shuttle was waiting to take her to the coastal resort where the conference would begin the next day. As she stepped aboard, she didn't check her phone. She didn't open Twitter or scan news headlines. She stared out the window, watching palm trees blur past in slow motion. She needed to reclaim something quiet before the noise caught up to her. Miles away, at a different resort, Camille was walking through a marble lobby with air conditioning too cold for her sleeveless blouse. The concierge greeted her with a practiced smile and handed her a welcome drink. She took it, but barely tasted the liquid. She needed Wi-Fi, privacy, and control. She reached her suite, a sprawling ocean view room she had chosen for its silence, and immediately dropped her bag beside the sofa. Her fingers moved quickly on her phone, disabling airplane mode. What followed was a flood. Messages, emails, missed calls, her assistant, her colleagues, her niece, even a board member she hadn't spoken to in 2 years. Most were vague. "Hey, are you okay? You should check Twitter. What's going on?" But a few were blunt. "You're everywhere. This is bad. They've got your name. Camille. You need to get in front of this." She opened the video. There she was, frozen in a moment she could no longer control. The captain's voice clear, her face visible, her discomfort on full display. The comments scrolled beneath it at nauseating speed. One line hit the hardest. She wanted another seat, and now she's losing her seat at the table. Camille threw the phone onto the bed and walked to the balcony. The view was stunning. Blue water, sunlight glinting off the horizon, the promise of paradise. But none of it mattered. Not anymore. At Polaris headquarters, Captain Reed Mallory had landed hours earlier in a different city. His inbox was already swelling with messages from airline leadership, commendations, requests for statements, public relations talking points. He declined them all. In a short reply, he wrote, "I acted in accordance with airline policy. No passenger deserves to be mistreated. I will not participate in media spin." Then he closed his laptop and poured himself a glass of water. The day had been long, but his conscience was quiet. Back in Belize, Zora sat on her hotel balcony with a notebook in her lap. She had finally opened her phone and seen what the world was saying. Her name was beginning to circulate. Articles referred to her as the woman in the viral video. Some praised her dignity. Others argued about her silence. One comment stood out. She didn't need to yell. Her refusal to shrink was louder than any scream. She closed her phone and stared at the ocean. In the distance, waves broke softly against the shore. She thought about her students, the conversation she would eventually have, the media requests waiting in her inbox, the interviews, the headlines, and she felt it again, that weight, the familiar burden of being made a symbol, not by choice, but by circumstance. Her phone buzzed with a message from Walter Linwood, the dean at Penwick University. "Zora, just saw the clip. Proud doesn't begin to cover it. Call when you're ready." She smiled faintly. The support mattered, but it didn't erase the discomfort. Zora opened her notebook and wrote a single sentence across the top of the page. "Visibility is not the same as justice." She let the words sit for a while before she began to write more. Thoughts, reflections, fragments. It didn't need to become an article or a speech. Maybe it never would, but it was hers, a place to put the weight. Elsewhere. Camille sat at the edge of her hotel bed with her elbows on her knees. Her phone was in her hand again. The video had passed 2 million views. She received an email from Gregory Vaughn, the CEO of Helix Petro Corp. Subject urgent. "Camille, we need to talk as soon as you're back. Do not respond to media inquiries. Legal is reviewing." She didn't respond. There was nothing to say. The room was quiet, the air cold, her mind loud, and for the first time in a long time, Camille felt something she couldn't rationalize away. She felt afraid. Camille Thornton stepped off the return flight with her jaw clenched and her eyes hidden behind oversized sunglasses. The arrival hall at Atlanta's Hartsfield-Jackson was abuzz with its usual symphony of voices, rolling luggage, and airport announcements. But Camille didn't hear any of it. Her mind was elsewhere, locked in the hum of fear and calculation. She walked quickly, weaving through travelers without meeting a single eye. Her black trench coat, too warm for Georgia's heavy summer air, clung to her skin. Every step echoed louder in her mind than it did on the tile floor. A driver was waiting at the curb, holding a sign with her name. She climbed into the back of the black SUV without a word. The ride from the airport to Helix Petro Corp headquarters took just under 30 minutes. It felt like 3 hours. Camille kept her gaze fixed on the passing city. Familiar buildings blurred into a dull smear, a playground, a billboard for a diversity campaign. The irony cut deep. She had once signed off on that campaign herself. At the headquarters, the building loomed like a monolith of steel and tinted glass. She had always loved that view, the tower that bore her fingerprints, a place where her voice had once carried more weight than the CEO's. But this morning, the building didn't feel like power. It felt like judgment. She entered through the side door, as instructed. Security greeted her with the barest nod, directing her to the top floor. No badge, no key card. Someone had already deactivated her access. She rode the elevator alone. When the doors opened to the executive level, Camille found Gregory Vaughn waiting outside the boardroom. The CEO of Helix had always been composed, but today, his expression was carved in stone. "Inside," he said. She obeyed. The boardroom smelled like fresh leather and espresso. Camille had led global strategy sessions here, negotiated mergers, cut billion-dollar deals, but today, the walls felt narrower, the air heavier. 3 people were seated at the table. Gregory at the head, Eleanor Marsh from HR, Marcus Thorne, legal counsel. There were no handshakes, no greetings. Camille sat down slowly. Eleanor slid a document across the table. Her tone was clinical. "This is a notice of termination for cause." Camille stared at the paper. Gregory's voice was cold. "You know why you're here. The video. The fallout. We've been bombarded with media inquiries, investor panic, and internal backlash. Your face is all over the news. Our brand is tied to your name. Our stock has dipped 7 points in 48 hours. Camille looked down. Her throat was dry. Eleanor continued, "As per your executive contract, gross misconduct and reputational damage are grounds for immediate termination. Your severance is void. Your stock options frozen. Your company accounts suspended." Gregory leaned forward. "You didn't just embarrass yourself. Camille, you undermined everything we've built, everything we've claimed to stand for. You were the face of our Women in Leadership initiative. Now you're the symbol of what we pretend we're not." Camille opened her mouth, but her voice cracked before any words came. "I didn't mean for it to get like this. I wasn't trying to make it about race." Gregory's jaw tightened. "You didn't need to say it. The world saw what you did." Silence fell again. "We'll give you 15 minutes to collect your personal items," Eleanor said. "Security will escort you to the lobby. After today, you are not to return to this building." Camille's eyes burned. Her hands shook slightly as she reached for the paper. She had once imagined leaving Helix on her own terms, to start her own consultancy, maybe publish a book. But this wasn't an exit. It was an expulsion. And worse, it was public. She stood, holding the document to her chest like a shield. Nobody moved, not even to say goodbye. 15 minutes later, she walked through the office one last time. Colleagues she had mentored turned their eyes to their screens as she passed. Others whispered when they thought she was out of earshot. The familiar carpet now felt like ice under her heels. In her office, the framed photos were gone, her nameplate removed. The award for executive leadership still sat on the shelf. She stared at it for a long moment before leaving it behind. The security guard, polite but expressionless, walked a step behind her as she descended in the elevator. When the doors opened to the lobby, she didn't pause. She walked through the revolving doors into the bright morning light, and into a world that no longer looked at her the same. That afternoon, Zora Whitaker sat on a shaded patio at the conference venue in Belize, overlooking the ocean. A glass of iced tea sat untouched beside her as she stared at her laptop. Her inbox was overflowing. Dozens of interview requests, podcast appearances, offers to speak on national television, a message from a major book publisher, a request for a documentary profile, and all of it centered around one question. What does it feel like to go viral for simply existing? Zora wasn't sure how to answer. She scrolled through the comments. Most were supportive, kind, encouraging, but some were ugly, racist, threatening. She closed the laptop and sat back in her chair, staring at the horizon. She had told herself she wouldn't be drawn into the public noise, but the story had outgrown her. It was no longer about a seat on a plane. It had become a conversation, a debate, a movement. A student from the conference approached timidly. Her name tag read Carla. She was maybe 21, with tightly coiled hair and wide, earnest eyes. "Dr. Whitaker," she asked softly. Zora looked up. "I just wanted to say thank you for not letting yourself be moved." Zora smiled gently. "I didn't do it for applause." "I know," Carla said. "That's what made it matter more." She walked away. Zora watched her go, then turned her gaze back to the sea. Far across the ocean, in a different city, Camille Thornton sat in the back of her own car. The driver said nothing. The silence was unbearable. She took off her sunglasses and looked at her reflection in the window. For the first time, she didn't recognize herself. Zora Whitaker stood barefoot on the edge of the beach just after dawn, the ocean licking gently at her toes. The horizon was a soft blur of orange and gold, a watercolor sky smeared by early sun. For the first time in days, she was alone. She had woken before the rest of the conference attendees and slipped away without checking her phone. No emails, no alerts. Just the sound of water meeting sand and the rhythm of her breath. She wasn't trying to escape the story. She just needed to remember that she existed outside of it. That she was still herself, not just a trending topic. Behind her, on the balcony of the hotel, Julian Vega watched her silhouette against the surf. He hadn't approached yet. Something about her posture told him not to. She was deep in something. Maybe reflection, maybe weariness, maybe both. Inside his room, his inbox had become a digital wildfire. His post had crossed 10 million views overnight. He had been offered guest spots on 3 major morning shows. A tech outlet offered him a freelance contract to cover everyday resistance moments. Even a sponsorship inquiry had slipped in, offering a promo deal for an airline pillow company. The irony made him laugh out loud. But Julian wasn't chasing a brand. He just hadn't expected one quiet moment of humanity to ripple this far. He watched Zora a while longer, then finally stepped out onto the beach. His sandals left faint impressions in the damp sand as he approached her, cautiously. She didn't turn until he was beside her. "Morning," he said softly. Zora nodded. "It is. You always greet the day barefoot, only when the world feels too heavy. The ground reminds me I still belong somewhere." Julian nodded slowly. "That's beautiful. Or maybe just truthful." They stood in silence for a while, watching the waves roll in. "Do you ever wonder," Zora said after a while, "what justice actually looks like?" Julian tilted his head. "Every day. But lately, I'm starting to think it's not a destination. It's more like a calibration, a series of small corrections." Zora smiled faintly, spoken like a man who understands balance. Julian hesitated, then asked, "Do you want to control the narrative?" She looked at him. I mean, it's spreading without you. People are speaking for you, about you. Do you want to speak for yourself?" Zora took a breath, not to defend, not to explain, but maybe to redirect. He nodded. "If you ever want help putting that into words, or editing something, I'm here." She turned to him with gratitude in her eyes. "Thank you." Meanwhile, across the ocean in Atlanta, Camille Thornton was beginning her third day of isolation. Her phone was still off. She hadn't turned on the television or opened a news app, but she didn't need to. The silence around her had shape, texture. It was loud in its absence. Her apartment had never felt so unfamiliar. The polished floors, the marble kitchen, the curated artwork, all of it suddenly felt performative, like a museum exhibit of the woman she had tried to be. A knock came at the door. Camille flinched. She waited, breath held, but it came again. She stood slowly and looked through the peephole. It was Marlene, her sister. Camille opened the door. "I was starting to think you'd evaporated," Marlene said. "You look—" "Well, never mind." Camille stepped aside. "Come in." The two women moved into the living room. Marlene sat with casual familiarity, brushing a crumb off the edge of the sofa. Camille remained standing. "I'm not in the mood for a lecture," she said. "I didn't come to lecture. I came because you disappeared, and because I'm your sister, not your PR team." Camille's arms folded. Marlene looked at her closely. "You look like you haven't slept." "I haven't," Camille said. Marlene was quiet for a moment. "You're not the only one getting heat. You know, our family name's been dragged into this. People have been calling me, asking questions I don't have answers to." Camille's voice was low. "I never meant for this to happen." "I believe that," Marlene said. "But meaning doesn't undo impact." Camille sat down finally, exhaling like it hurt. "I'm not racist. No one thinks you're wearing a hood in your free time. But what happened on that plane, Camille? You used discomfort as justification. You acted like proximity was threat." Camille's eyes welled up. "I didn't say anything. You didn't have to. That's the point. Your silence was loud." There was a long pause. Marlene softened her voice. "Do you want to be the victim in this? Or do you want to learn something from it?" Camille looked away. "Because one road lets you disappear in shame," Marlene continued, "and the other makes you accountable. That's the only choice you have left." Outside, a lawnmower buzzed faintly in the distance. Camille nodded slowly, finally breaking. "I don't know who I am anymore." "That's not a bad place to start," Marlene said gently. "In Belize." Zora sat in front of her laptop once again. A blank document waited for her to begin. She had declined all major interviews, politely, firmly, not because she was afraid, but because she wanted her voice to arrive on her own terms. She began typing, not all violent shouts. Sometimes it whispers through policies, through gatekeeping, through subtle exclusions. Sometimes it's wrapped in politeness, cloaked in fear. She paused, then continued. "On Flight 627, I was not brave. I was tired. Tired of bending. Tired of moving. Tired of being asked to disappear so others could stay comfortable. I stayed seated. That's all. But in that stillness, something broke. And maybe that break was necessary." She stopped typing and read the words aloud. They felt honest. She scrolled back to the top and gave it a title. "The Seat I Didn't Give Up." Zora Whitaker had published just before midnight the essay, titled "The Seat I Didn't Give Up," went live on a quiet university blog hosted by Penwick's Humanities Department. There was no press release, no tweet storm, no coordinated media rollout, just her words, resting quietly in digital space. She had told herself she wouldn't check it. She'd release it into the world and step back. But less than an hour later, the page had already crashed once from heavy traffic. By sunrise, it was on the homepage of 3 major online magazines. By noon, it had been translated into 6 languages. It was the kind of essay that didn't shout. It lingered. It unsettled. It pulled people inward. She didn't name Camille Thornton. She didn't recount every detail of the flight. What she shared wasn't about a single woman's poor choice or a viral confrontation. It was about years of invisible shifting, about micro-decisions, about who was expected to yield and who was allowed to feel entitled to space. And it resonated. Thousands of comments poured in. I read this at my desk and cried. This essay explained something my wife has been trying to tell me for years. My daughter shared this with her high school class. Thank you. A well-known civil rights leader reposted the article and called it a masterclass in quiet defiance. A poet compared Zora's restraint to the elegance of Baldwin. A mother shared that her son asked her to read it aloud at dinner. Zora sat at her hotel desk in Belize, watching it unfold. She hadn't written it to go viral. But the truth, when spoken plainly, had its own gravity. Meanwhile, Julian Vega received a flood of interview requests. You were the one who filmed her. You captured the moment. Would you speak to us about what it felt like? He declined most of them. This was never about me, he said. It was about what she chose not to surrender. He linked to her essay instead. Let her tell it. Let her own her story. In Atlanta. Camille Thornton sat in her apartment wrapped in a blanket, the shades still drawn. Her television was muted, but the headline scrolling across the screen was unmistakable. The seat I didn't give up. Scholar's essay becomes defining moment in viral flight incident. Camille had tried not to read it, but the world was reading it for her. Her phone buzzed constantly, even after she had deleted most social apps. The doorbell rang again. She opened it to find her sister Marlene holding a brown paper bag. You look like you haven't eaten since the Industrial Revolution, Marlene said, handing it over. Camille managed a faint smile. Close enough. They sat in silence for a few minutes, eating Thai noodles out of takeout containers. The TV continued its silent stream of headlines in the background. You read it? Marlene asked finally. Camille didn't answer right away, then nodded. Yes, and it's devastating, Camille whispered, but not cruel. That's what makes it worse. Marlene tilted her head. Why worse? Because she had every right to call me out, to name me, to humiliate me. But she didn't. She let me remain faceless, and in doing that, she made me see myself. Marlene didn't speak. She let the weight settle. Camille put down her container and stared into her lap. I keep going over that moment on the plane, she said quietly. I wasn't even thinking clearly. I just reacted. I let discomfort guide me. I didn't see her as a person. I saw her as a problem. Marlene leaned forward slightly. And now I see the version of myself I never wanted to admit existed. She wiped at her eyes with the sleeve of her sweatshirt. I thought I was better than this. Marlene's voice was soft. Maybe now you can be. Outside the apartment, life continued. Horns honked. Birds called. But inside, something was slowly rebuilding. Later that night, Camille wrote an email. She stared at the blank screen for over an hour before typing. Subject apology. Dr. Whitaker. You do not know me, and I do not deserve your time. But I read your essay, every word, and while I do not expect your forgiveness, I needed to say this. I am sorry, deeply, profoundly. I have spent my life preaching leadership and poise, and yet, when truly tested, I failed both. Your silence on that flight was more powerful than anything I have ever said in a boardroom. I hope one day to be the kind of person who can earn back a measure of dignity. Camille Thornton. She hit send and closed the laptop. The message sat in Zora's inbox in Belize, unread as the evening sky turned violet above the Caribbean. At that same moment, a student club at Penwick University was planning a public reading of Zora's essay, not for spectacle, but for reflection. In a small apartment in Chicago, a retired black school teacher printed the essay and mailed it to her granddaughter with a handwritten note. This is what courage can look like without fists. In the newsroom of a major outlet, a young journalist fought to keep the essay unedited when they suggested shortening it for readability. You don't trim truth, she said. You listen, and in a quiet hotel room. Zora sat with her tea cooling beside her as she finally opened Camille's email. She read it once, then again. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. But she didn't reply. Not yet. Sometimes grace needed silence, too. When Zora Whitaker touched down in Atlanta, everything felt the same, yet quietly altered. The baggage claim still smelled faintly of cinnamon pretzels and jet fuel. The floor tiles still glistened beneath the overhead fluorescence. But the way people looked at her had changed. Not everyone recognized her, but some did. The glances were tentative, curious. A few were warm, a silent thank you offered with a nod or a smile. One woman, maybe in her 50s, clutched her chest when she saw Zora pass and whispered, "Bless you," like a prayer. Zora responded with the gentlest smile. But each interaction carried weight. She had not asked to be seen this way. She walked through the terminal with her tote slung over one shoulder, a navy scarf tied neatly at her neck, and a kind of gravity that pulled eyes without demanding them. Outside, Julian Vega waited by the curb. His car idled behind a long line of Ubers and taxis. When he saw her, he jumped out and opened the door. "You didn't have to," she said, slipping into the passenger seat. "I know," Julian replied, "but I wanted to—" They drove in silence for a while, the skyline rising slowly in the distance. "Your essay," he said finally, "is now part of a university curriculum in 4 states. You're being quoted in Senate hearings. They're calling it the seat essay." Zora didn't respond right away. She watched the road ahead, her fingers gently gripping the edge of the seat. "I didn't write it for attention," she said. "I wrote it because if I didn't, I'd carry it around like a stone inside me." "That's why it worked," Julian said softly. They arrived at her brownstone in Midtown. The porch light had been left on by a neighbor. The same wind chime still hung by the front door, its soft notes ringing like memory. Before Zora stepped out, Julian handed her a small package. "I printed the comments section," he said with a sheepish grin. "Figured you might want to read it one day when all of this feels a little less heavy." Zora held the envelope close. "Thank you," she said. He nodded and drove off. Inside, her home smelled like old books and lavender oil. She unpacked slowly, piece by piece, placing her sandals by the door, folding her scarves, returning the rhythm of her life to the shelves and corners that knew her best. Later that night, she sat in her study surrounded by letters, handwritten ones, typed ones, notes from strangers who had found pieces of themselves in her story. Survivors, dreamers, students, even flight attendants. She lit a candle and began reading them one by one. Meanwhile, across the city, Camille Thornton walked into a community center she hadn't visited in over a decade. The building sat in a quiet neighborhood tucked between shuttered shops and cracked sidewalks. The front desk had faded pamphlets, a jar of plastic lollipops, and a clipboard with a volunteer sign-up sheet. Camille signed her name. The receptionist, a young woman with braids and a bright smile, looked up. Camille. Thornton. The Camille. Thornton. Camille winced. Just Camille today, if that's okay. The woman nodded slowly, the smile softening into something more sincere. Of course. Conference room's down the hall. They've been expecting you. Camille walked toward the back of the center, her heels clicking softly. The hallway was lined with framed photos of youth programs, voter registration drives, tutoring sessions. At the end of the corridor, a small group of women sat around a table. One of them looked up. You showed up, she said. Camille nodded. I said I would. The woman gestured toward an empty seat. We're not here to shame you, she said, but we are here to tell the truth, ours and yours, if you're willing to offer it. Camille sat down. There were no cameras, no reporters, just raw conversation, real stories, and the unglamorous, uncomfortable work of listening. She didn't speak much that first day. She didn't defend herself, didn't excuse what had happened. She listened. The next day, she returned. And the next, and something small but undeniable began to shift. Not public redemption, but private reckoning. At the university. Zora was preparing for her first lecture since the essay's release. The lecture hall was packed. Students sat in aisles. Faculty members lined the back wall. A few journalists were turned away at the door. She stepped up to the podium in a charcoal gray dress, her glasses resting low on her nose. The room quieted before she even spoke. She adjusted the microphone. Let me begin by saying I am not an icon. I am not a movement. I am not even brave. A murmur of surprise rippled through the audience. I am a woman who stayed in her seat. That's all. She paused. But what that moment revealed was how deeply we've trained ourselves to shrink, to shift, to believe that making others comfortable is the same as being good. She spoke for nearly an hour, not with theatrics, but with clarity. She wove personal experience with historical framing. She challenged, she questioned, she invited. And when she ended, the room stood in silence. Then applause, then tears, and outside, the world kept moving. But a shift had begun. 1 week later, Zora received an envelope in her campus mailbox. No return address. Inside was a simple note, written in careful cursive. I'm still unlearning, still sorry, still listening. Thank you for holding your seat. No signature. Just a small pressed flower enclosed in the fold. Zora held the letter gently. She didn't need to know who had sent it. She already knew. The conference hall in downtown Atlanta was humming with anticipation. Rows of chairs were filled with community leaders, activists, students, and curious onlookers. Banners hung from the ceiling, declaring the theme, Voices of Change Conversations on Race and Equity. Camille Thornton stood backstage, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. The usual corporate armor was stripped away, no tailored suits, no sharp heels. Instead, she wore a simple navy blouse and black slacks. Her hair, usually perfectly coiffed, was pulled back loosely. Her face was pale but determined. She had received the invitation 2 days ago from a local nonprofit focused on racial reconciliation. The email was brief but clear. We believe your story, your apology. Your journey could inspire honest dialogue. She had hesitated. How could she? A woman still grappling with shame and loss. Stand before a crowd and speak honestly. Could she face the shadow of her own actions without faltering? Her phone buzzed. A message from Marlene. You're stronger than you know. Camille closed her eyes and took a deep breath. The event coordinator appeared, signaling it was time. She walked toward the stage, each step heavier than the last. The spotlight warmed her skin as she approached the microphone. The chatter dimmed. She glanced at the sea of faces, some familiar, most strangers. A young woman with a notebook, a man holding his toddler, an elderly couple holding hands. She opened her mouth to speak, but paused. The words she had rehearsed so many times suddenly felt inadequate, hollow. Then she remembered something Marlene had said. Speak your truth, even if your voice shakes. Camille began. Thank you for inviting me here today. I'm not a hero. I'm not a role model. I'm a woman who made a mistake that hurt another woman and hurt myself in ways I didn't expect. Her voice wavered but grew steadier. I want to tell you about the flight, about the moment I refused to sit next to Dr. Zora Whitaker, about the discomfort I felt and the discomfort I caused. She took another breath, letting the silence fill the space. I asked to be moved because I was uncomfortable. That discomfort was not because of fear or ignorance. It was because of deep-seated biases I hadn't faced honestly. The audience listened, rapt. I want to apologize to Dr. Whitaker publicly and personally. Her dignity and grace taught me more about strength than I ever learned in a boardroom. Camille paused, eyes glistening. This journey is ongoing. I am learning to be accountable, not just for what I say, but for what I do, for who I am. The applause was soft at first, then swelling. Some stood. Tears glistened on faces. This was not a corporate speech. This was raw honesty. Backstage, Julian Vega watched the live stream with a smile. He sent a quick message to Zora. She's ready. Across the city. Zora sat at her desk watching Camille's speech unfold. She hadn't planned to watch, but something told her this was important. When Camille apologized on camera, Zora felt a knot loosen inside her. After the speech, a young man approached Camille. I want to thank you for your courage, he said. I'm a teacher in a nearby school. My students need to hear this kind of honesty. Camille smiled, exhausted but hopeful. In the following days, Camille's story shifted in the media. Articles focused not on the viral incident alone, but on the redemptive arc she was beginning to write. Editorials debated the complexities of accountability and growth. Social media buzzed with conversations about humility and change. Zora and Camille did not meet in person, but their stories had intertwined. They had become unlikely catalysts for a broader dialogue about race, space, and dignity. One afternoon, Zora received an email from Camille. Dear Dr. Whitaker, I want to thank you again for your quiet strength. Your essay changed the way I see myself and the world. I would be honored if you would join me in a panel discussion next month. Together, perhaps we can foster conversations that matter. Zora smiled as she typed her reply. Thank you, Camille. I would be glad to. As autumn settled over the city, both women prepared to step into a shared spotlight. Their stories, once marked by conflict, were now chapters in a larger story of reckoning and hope. The auditorium was packed. A soft murmur hummed through the room as people settled into their seats. The stage was set for a panel titled Reclaiming Space Stories of Reckoning and Resilience. On one side sat Zora Whitaker, poised and serene, in a deep green blouse, her hands resting lightly on her lap. On the other, Camille Thornton, no longer guarded but tentative, eyes shining with quiet resolve. Between them sat the moderator, who welcomed the crowd and framed the conversation. Tonight, we hear two perspectives on a moment that captured the world's attention. A confrontation at 30,000 feet that became a catalyst for dialogue on race, dignity, and accountability. The lights dimmed slightly. Zora looked at Camille and nodded gently. Camille returned the gesture, a fragile bridge forming. The moderator posed the first question. Dr. Whitaker, when you refused to move that day, what was going through your mind? Zora took a breath. It was not a decision made lightly. I was tired of constantly shrinking, of being told that my presence was an inconvenience. Sitting in that seat was a quiet rebellion against erasure. The audience was silent, hanging on every word. Camille spoke next. For me, that moment became a mirror. It showed me parts of myself I had ignored, biases, fears, discomforts. I realized that accountability isn't about punishment, but about change. The conversation unfolded with honesty. They spoke of systemic injustice and personal responsibility, of the weight of history carried silently in everyday spaces, of the courage required to face oneself and the world anew. Questions from the audience invited vulnerability and learning. A teacher shared how she used the story to teach empathy. A student asked how to confront prejudice in daily life. A flight attendant spoke about the importance of standing firm in the face of discrimination. The event was more than a panel. It was a movement. Afterward, Camille and Zora stepped outside, into the warm night. The city lights glittered around them like stars come to earth. I never imagined this, Camille said softly, that something so painful could lead here. Zora smiled. Neither did I. But the flight isn't over. We're still climbing. Camille looked out over the cityscape, then back at Zora. Thank you for not letting me disappear. Zora's eyes glistened. Thank you for being brave enough to stay. Their stories, once defined by confrontation, had merged into something greater, a testament to the possibility of growth, forgiveness, and the unyielding fight for dignity. As they parted ways that night, neither knew what challenges awaited, but both understood that this was no longer about seats or flights. It was about the spaces they all deserved to occupy, with respect and without apology. And sometimes, the longest journeys begin with the simplest acts choosing to remain seated. This story leaves us with more than just the memory of a viral moment. It holds a mirror to our society's ongoing struggle with prejudice and dignity. We witnessed how silence can be a form of strength, and how accountability demands not just words, but deep reflection and change. Camille Thornton's journey from denial to humility reminds us that growth often begins in uncomfortable places, while Dr. Zora Whitaker's quiet resilience shines as a beacon of grace under pressure. Discrimination, in any form, wounds more than the immediate victim. It scars communities, undermines progress, and tests our collective humanity. This story calls on each of us to recognize the harm caused by bias, to speak out, and to stand firm in the face of injustice. Thank you for listening and reflecting with us. If this story touched your heart or opened your eyes, please hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel for more real stories where courage meets consequence. Together, we can build a world where respect isn't conditional and everyone's seat at the table is honored. Stay tuned for our next story that will challenge you, inspire you, and remind you that change begins with each of us.